Hi everyone, this is Kevin Wagner, the Keto Advocate. In January of 2016, I had the privilege to sit down and chat with Dr. David Diamond at the first annual conference on nutritional ketosis and metabolic therapeutics held in Tampa, Florida. Let's see what Dr. Diamond had to say.
Okay, so I'm David Diamond. My background actually is in neuroscience. I've been studying the brain, memory, and stress for about the past 35 years.
Okay. Could you tell us about the topic you'll be speaking about here at the conference?
Well, I won't be talking about neuroscience. I'll be focusing pretty much on just historical perspective on low-carb diet, the demonization of fats in general, dietary fats, and then specifically saturated fats. The idea that consuming saturated fats, which would be the fats found in tropical oils and animal fat, that those fats specifically will increase cholesterol, damage our arteries, and produce heart disease. So I'm going to talk about how that simply is not supported by the research, and I'll talk about how it is that the effect of saturated fat on the diet has been misrepresented by bad science. Well, I should say, unlike the other speakers at this conference, I'm not a ketogenic diet scientist. This is not a part of my research. I actually did conduct a study a decade ago before I learned about ketogenic diet, in which I showed actually that a diet high in fat and sugar actually interacted with stress to produce brain damage. And so actually the damage was greater with the animals that had both the stress and the diet with fat and sugar. So I will briefly talk about that study. I'm also interested in studies on traumatic brain injury and how the outcome could be exacerbated by a diet high in sugar, high blood sugar. And potentially a treatment for a traumatic brain injury could be either low-carb diet in general or specifically to give ketones to reduce the inflammation following brain damage. Oh, certainly, because the brain thrives actually on ketones. Under normal conditions, with the typical Western diet that we have, the brain never sees ketones. So the brain is entirely dependent then on glucose. And what you find is greater inflammation under a condition in which the brain is dependent on glucose compared to this combination of glucose with ketones. So I think an outstanding study would be to deliver ketones to an individual, whether we start with animals and then ultimately have a clinical project in which people who suffer concussion, this could be applied in sports as well as a military condition, that the delivery of ketones very well, there's good reason to believe, will improve outcomes with TBI. And I would certainly like to participate in that.
Okay. Would you see the ketogenic diet alone being helpful?
Well, the ketogenic diet certainly is helpful. It is difficult. But I think one way to approach this is a person that is vulnerable either to brain damage, cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's. They all would benefit from the ketogenic diet. Right. I think the idea actually is that elevated blood glucose, which then produces an elevation of glucose in the brain, contributes to inflammation. The glucose actually damages protein. The glucose can literally attach to protein molecules, which then interferes with their functioning. So the glucose actually exacerbates the inflammation in the brain. So keeping blood glucose low and increasing the ketones will be the optimal kind of hormonal milieu and energy milieu for the brain to recover from traumatic brain injury.
Okay, and ketones can lower glucose as well?
Well, ketones alone then will stimulate an increase in insulin, which then will lower blood glucose. And so typically when one is on a ketogenic diet, for a person that doesn't have type 1 diabetes, what you'll find is the ketones stimulate release of insulin, insulin lowers blood glucose, and you have a nice balance, which actually is very important for having the right pH in the blood. And so you'll have low blood glucose, high ketones, which is actually very efficient for both brain and heart functioning. You know, it's surprising, you're absolutely right, that I hear this said so many times by professionals, by doctors, by personal trainers, by dietitians. It's accepted as dogma, as fact, that we need to eat carbohydrates. That's an essential nutrient. That the brain thrives on glucose, so the brain needs glucose. And this is simply incorrect. We don't need to consume glucose. The body makes plenty of glucose by itself. The brain does not need glucose to be consumed and does not require high levels of glucose. Under normal conditions, in which one has a low-carb diet, the brain uses glucose and ketones very efficiently. And there's even a suggestion, and we'll hear about at the conference, that in dementia, the brain may actually function even better when it is given ketones. Because it may very well be that, particularly in Alzheimer's, the brain cells may not process glucose very efficiently. And so they, in a sense, have reduced availability of energy, which increases then inflammation in the brain, potentially related to Alzheimer's disease. Whereas the cells can process ketones. So it may very well be that giving the cells this combination of glucose and ketones may actually enhance recovery from dementia. Well, I've actually worked with people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. I've been funded by the Veterans Administration for decades. I have great interest in stress and brain functioning. And people who are stressed have a high rate of heart disease. So I think what's very important in heart disease is to keep the blood sugar low. The heart functions better when you have ketones present along with low blood sugar. So I think one potential component of a treatment for PTSD is to include ketone supplementation. Now, I know of no work that is currently doing that, but that would be a fantastic study in which I would welcome participating in.